Good morning. This morning we're going to be talking about freedom through forgiveness, freedom that we actually can experience by forgiving. And this happens to be one of the most difficult lessons that I am continuously learning in my life. Just about the time I think I got it, something happens to remind me that I'm still not quite there. There's some questions that I find very helpful to ask yourself when we're talking about forgiveness. The first of that question would be, who benefits when you forgive someone? Are you benefiting the person that you're forgiving, or is the forgiveness a benefit to you? And in this case, I do believe that it's both. Each person is basically released of some sort of burden when we do that. If we hold a grudge against someone, who's actually paying the price? When I think about that question, I think about grudges that I have in my past held against people. Honestly, the person who was the most influenced by that grudge was me, not the person that I held the grudge against. So it didn't really do any good to do that. And then, of course, there's that question of, does it matter if the person or persons that we forgive don't even know we've forgiven them? So there's a lot of those cases where we do offer forgiveness to other people and they either don't know it or don't accept it. Again, that is a release of the burden that you're holding. You're releasing those chains and giving it up to the universe. Basically, you're releasing those attachments that come with not giving forgiveness. Now, as I was thinking about what I want to talk about today, a memory from my childhood, which has always been very, very strong, came forward. When I was about 11 or 12, I built a tree house in the back of my yard. It did not look at all like that. I wish that it had, but it didn't. It was a rickety tree house built by your typical 11 or 12-year-old boy. And I really loved this treehouse because it was my sanctuary. It was my fortress of solitude. Nobody could get into it. There was no ladder. There was no rope. You had to be somewhat athletic to even be able to get up into it. It was my sanctuary from my sister, from my parents, from pretty much anyone. And I had used a bunch of my stepfather's tools to build this treehouse. Unfortunately, I was a typical 11 or 12-year-old kid who didn't understand the concept of putting anything back. So a weekend came, my stepfather was looking for a hammer or a saw. I don't know what it was that he was looking for, but it wasn't where it was supposed to be. So this grand search commenced to find it. Whatever it was that was missing was never found. However, my stepfather's punishment to me was to have me tear down this treehouse. Every piece of wood had to be removed and taken down. I swore at that moment that I would never forgive him. Years passed, I didn't even think about this treehouse. And something happened and a memory came up, and I was immediately transported back to when I was that 11 or 12-year-old child. And the anger and the animosity that I had towards him came all back. And I had held true to my word. I had not forgiven him. By this time, I was also doing a lot of my studies and into meditation and those things like that. So this concept of forgiveness and forgiving the past was something I was hearing on a constant basis. So I decided, okay, now's as good a time as any to go ahead and forgive it. And so I said, I forgive you. That didn't really work. There was more to that entire story, because what I didn't realize at the time was why it affected me so much, that treehouse was torn down, and how it affected so many other things in my life, because I never looked at the full situation. Having that initial creation that I had done that I was very proud of, torn down, actually gave me an excuse, though I didn't know it was an excuse, to not ever build or create anything after that. I started actually being very proud of the fact that I could not build anything. To the point that a running joke in my household is I'm the only one that anybody ever knows of that can build a set of shelves backwards. The point of this, the story, it sounds like it's about a treehouse, but I had to learn over the years to find forgiveness for the initial situation that happened, and also work through everything else that followed. Because there were a lot of little things that when you look at them and they link back to that initial something that I wasn't forgiving. And then when the subject of my stepfather would come up or the treehouse would come up, even though I said I forgive you, I had not done that. I hadn't released it. I still had an emotional attachment to that situation. And to me, that's what forgiveness does. It releases your attachment to the event. Now, what I've learned is, first I had to understand what forgiveness was not, because this was a hard one for me to get through. Forgiveness doesn't mean condoning the actions of others. When you forgive somebody, you're not saying that what they have done is okay. You're just letting go of that attachment to it. And it's also not accepting the actions of others as acceptable. Just because I forgive someone for doing something doesn't mean that I think it's okay for them to continue doing it or to do it to me. And that was when people talked about forgiveness, it seemed to me that that was what they were saying is, okay, I forgive you and just continue treating me the way that you're treating. And that's not really it. For me, freedom through forgiveness comes from recognizing that we are all connected. What I do to you, you do to me. And it is, so when we're offering that forgiveness, not only are we forgiving the other person, we're forgiving ourselves. Forgiveness is not forgetting. You don't forget, but you let go of that emotional connection and that attachment to the situation. And then you release it to a higher power. Now, forgiveness also recognizes the individual free will and right to do what somebody else wants to do and needs to be without accepting the burden or blame for yourself. Just because I forgive somebody doesn't mean that I have to accept that burden for anything that they do or don't do. How others treat me, speak to me, or feel about me, in the end, it really isn't about me. It's that holding on to it is what causes us so many emotional, spiritual, psychological issues. Now, the best explanation I ever heard, and I apologize, I don't know where I heard it from, but I've heard it from multiple sources. When talking about forgiveness, is holding a grudge is like drinking poison and expecting your enemy to get sick. Now, here's the thing. As long as I see them as the enemy or opposition, I've absolutely not forgiven. Whenever I wish the law of karma to enter into their lives, I've definitely not forgiven. I haven't released my attachment to that situation. And if I dwell on it, if I continue to replay it over and over and over again, I've obviously not released it. I've not forgiven it, which means there's more to learn from it. When we forgive, I truly believe that we free ourselves of that burden, and it no longer becomes ours. And when we seek forgiveness or request forgiveness, we are in truth forgiving ourselves. And it's not our burden when we're not forgiven. It's only our burden if we allow it to. So if you seek forgiveness from somebody else and they withhold it, it's no longer your burden. It is somebody else's. And I think that is a very freeing thought, because there are things that, sometimes we might wish we had done differently. We can't change them. All we can do is strive to do better in the future. Now, there are times when forgiveness is hard. I experience this so many times in my life, it's unbelievable. When forgiveness is hard, the only thing that we're left that we can do is to forgive often and as many times as it takes. We can recognize that the divine is perfect and focus on the God self of that individual rather than on the actual deed that we're forgiving. And when all else fails, we can be open to the possibility of forgiving at some point. So even if you're not in a position or in that moment ready to forgive, at least being open to that possibility of forgiving in the future begins that process. Just the simple idea of it brings us one step closer to fully forgiving. Now, I also used to think that it was easier to forgive myself than it was to forgive other people. What I actually learned is it's hardest to forgive myself than it is to other people because I have a higher expectation sometimes of myself, and I can be overly critical. So that freedom through forgiveness becomes even more powerful when we can use that towards ourselves and truly forgive ourselves for the things that we did or didn't do, for the things that we think we should or shouldn't do. And as we all know here in this room, there really are no such things as should and shouldn't. So to conclude this morning, one of the things that gives me strength is to realize that, one, I can't ever give up on the concept of forgiveness. And the simple attempt and desire to forgive will start that process of liberation. The more I forgive, the easier it becomes, and the more I forgive. And each act of forgiveness will bring me closer to releasing any chains that bind, and it brings me a step closer to spiritual freedom and union with the divine. Thank you.
It's interesting. Nathan and I have a topic, and we both just go with it. We don't communicate at all about what we're going to talk about. So thank you for doing my talk. That's all I wanted to say. We're on the same page. Mostly. And that's the beauty, right? Mostly. If we only have one way to think, then we don't really have an open mind. And that's what I think is so important about what we do here. Everybody has their own thought process. Everyone has their own opinion. Mine's right, yours is wrong, but that's beside the point. No, I'm kidding. So we know that forgiveness is a spiritual practice. It is not a mental practice. When we try, and I say try, hear that, to forgive from our mind, and try and intellectualize things, we find ourselves in a struggle with righteousness, separation from whatever it is we're seeking to forgive. Whereas in the spiritual practice of forgiveness, we aren't arguing from revenge. We're not assuming the role of judge and jury. Our ego is not in charge as we use our spiritual practices. What we're doing is we're working on transcending those condemning thoughts, those judgments. We want to move away from those. We want to be able to connect soul to soul, not just with ourselves, with anybody or anything else that we're struggling with. We want to be able to connect with that divine essence in whomever else we're struggling with in that conflict. Because here's the truth, our spiritual self only knows acceptance, love, joy, oneness. Isn't that the truth? That's who we are. And our higher self only wants to love unconditionally. Only wants to experience that intimate relationship with the divine in and through all of creation. So the purpose of practicing forgiveness, of course, as Reverend Nathan alluded to and actually said, isn't for the other person. Really has nothing to do with them. It's to free the forgiver, you, me. It frees us, not anybody else. As he said, the person that we have forgiven can do with it what they will. It's none of our business. When we carry around that unforgiveness, what we're doing is we are keeping ourselves attached to that person, to that situation, the one that we've judged or the one that we've condemned. And that's exactly what we're trying to release ourselves from. So intellectually, it makes no sense when we do that. Welcome to being human, right? Because that's what we do. We are certainly welcome to stay in that place of judgment and hold on to the resentment, to the anger, to the frustration, the guilt, shame, regret, whatever it is we want to. We can hold on to it. However, the downside is in holding on to that is those things just become heavier and heavier and heavier in our physical being. As we carry them, we become so buried under the weight of those things, our reaction to hurts and wrongs, that we become paralyzed by what we're trying to separate ourselves from. Keeps us stuck in the past. When we're stuck in the past, we cannot be fully and completely present in the now and enjoy that. It isn't possible to remain fully present when we're carrying the past with us. Not when our energy is all tied up with the burden of attachment to whatever it is that didn't meet our expectation. Now that's really big, because that's where our hurts and our resentments come from. Something didn't meet our expectation. The truth is, the only reason why there's anything to forgive in the first place is that someone or something didn't do or didn't turn out like you expected. And you have decided that they, whomever they are, should pay for it. And who's paying for it? Doesn't seem to bother them a bit. If you've ever had that situation with a person or an event, doesn't bother them a bit. They get on with their lives. We're the ones suffering. When we finally become sick and tired of being sick and tired of it, it's time to move into that spiritual, not the mental, practice of forgiveness. What better time than right here, right now, to claim your own freedom through that forgiveness process? Not because, as he said, you're excusing someone else's behavior. That isn't the truth. It's because you'd rather be happy and free and loving than be right. Forgiveness can be, and many times is, really misunderstood. So we know it's not giving into somebody's inappropriate actions, nor is it condoning bad behavior or giving permission for that behavior to continue. That's what it isn't. So it's essential we understand forgiving as the spiritual practice that it truly is. And that is coming from the mind of our heart rather than the mind of our mind. This isn't an intellectual process. And that was a great example he gave. I forgive. Like that's going to work, but we all do it, right? That's an intellectual process. The practice of forgiveness is this: forgiving. 2 words, right? Forgiving. The giving of compassion, the giving of understanding, the giving of unconditional love to yourself and to others. It is forgiving. And forgiveness is our job, not God's job. And let me tell you what I mean by that. Human beings, the beautiful creatures that we are, we tend to live from a place of judgment, from a place of duality. Good, bad, right, wrong, right? And God only knows itself as good, only sees all of its creation as perfection, as beauty. So God is pure love, has no reason to forgive. How do you forgive for perfection? As humans, though, we do. We must forgive ourselves and each other so we can be happy, so we can be loving, so we can be kind, so we can be free. Sometimes we have this illusion that forgiveness is or should be that one-time event, and then it's over and done. I think we've all probably tried that, haven't we? One and done. Wouldn't that be beautiful? And as you found out, I'm sure, it isn't necessarily true. It's a process, and it does sometimes take more than a minute or even 5 to move through that process and to work through it. When the Apostle Peter from the Bible asked Jesus, how many times do I need to forgive? What was his response? 70 times 7. Forgive up to 70 times 7. In other words, forgive until it's done, until you're free from it, until it's not consuming you or upsetting you. You'll know that forgiveness is complete when you have that heart-opening feeling of gratitude for the person or the event or yourself. That's how you know it's done. The rules of forgiveness are designed for the mind of the heart, for our spiritual nature, for our true nature, even though that pain is rooted in our mind. And here's the truth, it's only in our mind, right? Meditation told us that, reminded us of that. To forgive another person, look to the God essence and forgive without expecting anything to change in the other person, right? You're forgiving for you to free yourself. It's a no strings attached process. That's where we can release and let go of that feeling of hurt, and at the same time want nothing from that person. That is how you become free and let go of attachment. Now, again, that's not something that you'll necessarily accomplish overnight. I went from 1 to 5 minutes, right? Now I'm talking overnight. And it could be even longer. I'm just saying. It takes time to invoke those qualities of patience and loving kindness toward ourselves and others through this process. Now, I, of course, am not an advocate of forgive and forget. That's not what I'm talking about here. You want to remember what has transpired, what has happened in the growth process, in that challenging growth process. You want to remember, and you don't necessarily want it to happen again. So you're aware, you're cognizant of that. And I also understand that there's no spiritual bypass in the forgiveness process. And what I mean by that is some people say, oh, I'm just going to hand it over, which ultimately is a good thing, right? But if we have feelings of rage or anger or frustration or revenge, it needs to be processed. It needs to be acknowledged, not tucked away, not pretending that it doesn't exist. We need to take care of our human emotional being. It's not helpful for us on an emotional or physical level to use that concept of being holy or self-sacrificing. That's not helping us at all. That's just an excuse to gloss over feelings of pain and feelings of hurt. Acknowledge it and then turn it over. If action needs to be taken, honor yourself and do what you're guided to do. And sometimes there's nothing to do except for tell the universe, God, source, all the powers in the universe, this is how I feel, this is how what I need forgiveness through or for. Now, there have been or will be times when we get stuck and we cannot find it in our heart to forgive. Anybody ever had that? I get two hands, right? At that point, you know what we do? All we can do is be willing to forgive and start the process from there. Be willing to be willing. And from that place, we can consciously create a space through which we can invoke that divine within, and surrender to it. Once our heart softens, and it will, when we do that forgiveness process enough, it opens and allows that letting go to take place. And that's when we allow Spirit to come in and do its work. Then we can see that Christ or that Buddha within self, within others. And we'll begin to accept the idea and the practice of forgiving 70 times 7. One really important aspect of forgiveness is taking responsibility for our part in a situation. It doesn't matter if we're the wronged or the wrongdoer. We have a part. We were there. It's important to release any idea of being victimized or having been the victim. Because spiritually, there are no victims. Only the manifestation of the one. Forgiveness will open this really very wide gate in your heart. And that love that is trapped inside of you will break free, will dissolve any resentment or fear that has kept you in bondage. It is just like being born again. It is when you love unconditionally that you can truly forgive. Be gentle, be loving, be tolerant with yourself throughout this entire process. Because this is a one day at a time course of action. Thank you for being here this morning while I shared the truth as I understand it.